Hello, everyone. So good afternoon and welcome to the Grant Writing 101 workshop. My name is Gabriel Granco and I'm the chair for professional development of the Kansas State Postdoctoral Association. So if you are one of the postdocs here in campus, please come talk with me or with our leaders that are on the back there to learn more about how the postdocs here in campus organize themselves, and we do some events such as this one, and they're really good, so come join us. Also, I want to just make a quick introduction and say that we all know the importance of grant writing and the importance of securing funding for your career and the development of our research. This afternoon is going to be packed with a lot of useful information, so please enjoy this and take advantage of this opportunity. So in order to keep moving, I just want to say thank you to our speakers who's going to be leading us this afternoon, and also for our co-sponsors, the Vice President for Research Office of Research Development, the Writing Center, the grant specialists from College of Agriculture and the Veterinary Medicine, and also the Graduate Student Council, who also have some opening remarks for us.
Thank you so much. Many of you just got to meet me as your doorman, but I actually am the president of the Graduate Student Council. My name is Emily Pasco, for those of you who don't know me. Besides the doorman role I just took on. This is one of the events, thanks to all this generous support from people around campus, that does constitute as a professional development event. So many of you are aware that the Graduate Student Council has a professional development event series. For each event you attend, there's there's multiple benefits to going to professional development events, but in addition to that, in attending 5 events, you are eligible to receive a professional development certificate, which will be given out this year on April 23rd at the awards and recognition ceremony to recognize the additional work that you go above and beyond to make yourself better outside of academia and in the professional field. The other aspect is that for every professional development event you attend, you get a half point towards travel awards. So the competitive travel awards are on a point earn based system, and this is a way to get a little extra points on those applications. In order to do that, you must check in. You also must write that on your applications, but you also must check in. So thank you so much for being so organized in that process. Because this is a long event today, you have the ability to earn credit twice. So those of you who are looking to earn credit, you're going to check back in with me after that halfway mark, and I will be out by the computers where you just checked in earlier for that second part. If you're not interested in credit anyway, you do not need to check back in for the second part, but if you are, please come see me at that time. And with that, thank you so much for being here and being part of the K-State community.
Okay, hi, I'm Beth Montalone. I'm a faculty member in biology, but more importantly for today, I serve as the director of the Office of Research Development, which is one of the units of the Vice President for Research Office. So my job is to welcome you. We have a great turnout of graduate students and postdocs, but we also have some faculty, some earlier career than others. I'm looking at you, Zod. And we are, very happy that you are joining us as well. And we hope that you all get something out of this. One of the questions that maybe your apartment mate or spouse might have asked you was, what are you doing today? And you said, I'm going to this workshop. And you're like, what are you doing that for? Why are you spending your whole afternoon doing that? Well, okay, graduate students get credit, but faculty and postdocs don't, so why are they here? Well, if you want to do anything in academia or as a professional in a STEM field or in other disciplines, there's a good chance that at some point you're going to need to write a proposal to get some funding to do something. Unless you have rich relations or you are in the habit of buying lottery tickets and are a lot luckier than most people that do that, chances are that the only way you're going to get money to support whatever kinds of creative, scholarly research activities you want to do is by getting grants. And there's a lot of different sources for getting grants. And we'll talk just about a few of those today, but that's not going to be the focus of today's efforts. So I'm going to put in a plug for our weekly newsletter, The Funding Connection, that my colleague, Dr. Marino, assembles very carefully every week. And that is seen in our Research Weekly newsletter. And Mary Lou very carefully collates information from a whole range of sources to give information about federal grants, state grants, community, private foundations, and so forth. And so there's just a huge swath of information there. And she highlights all different kinds of funding opportunities. So that should be the first place you go to look to see where you might find opportunities to get grants. So suppose you found something, well, what do you do next? And that's what we're going to cover today. And so I'm going to not babble at you any further. I'm going to let the real content experts come up and start talking. And we're going to lead off with Amy Brusk, who is in the Grant Support Office at the College of Veterinary Medicine. And she is going to talk to you about grant terminology and proposal process.
Good afternoon. My name is Amy, and I've been with K-State for 15 years, and I've been in research administration for 12. And so my job in the College of Veterinary Medicine is to help them find funding, and then when they get it, I help them manage it. So today I'm going to go over some, let's see if I can get this going here. Here we go. I'm going to talk about briefly the research support offices that we have here at K-State, and you'll probably see a similar structure at any other institutions that you end up in the future as future faculty. We're going to go over the life cycle of a grant. We're going to go over how do you find funding opportunities, how you develop a proposal, what do you do when you get an award, how do you manage that award, and then finally, when that award ends, how we close it out. This is a real brief rundown of all the research support offices that we have here at K-State. So it's basically broken up into two big chunks. You have your pre-award side, which is what helps you get the proposal together and submitted, and then you have your post-award side, which is the accounting and the financial side of it, which would be, more like sponsored programs accounting. So all of these offices work together in a complicated and seamless way to help make sure that grants are administered in a helpful way to you and that are in compliance with federal and university regulations. All right, so the life cycle of a grant. So the first thing that you have to do is to find your funding. We have a lot of resources for that. Just like Dr. Montalone mentioned, there's the Research Weekly. We have a link. If you go to that research/faculty/funding, there's several different resources on there to kind of point you in the right direction. A couple of acronyms that you might see or hear when you're looking for funding are listed up there. FOA, Funding Opportunity Announcement, PA, Program Announcement, RFA, RFP, all of those are basically different terms of call for proposals, agencies that are looking for people to submit grant proposals. The last two, pre-proposal / white paper and letter of intent, those are kind of a pre stage. So a lot of times funding agencies will ask for a pre-proposal or a white paper, which is usually a 1 or 2 page document that's submitted, doesn't usually ask for a budget. And then a lot of times what'll happen is you'll be required to submit that pre-proposal and then be invited back to submit a full proposal. Sometimes our federal agencies will require a letter of intent. You won't necessarily require a letter to get invited back for a full, but they'll ask for a letter of intent so they can kind of get an idea of what kind of applicants are we looking at, and it kind of helps prepare review committees for when full proposals are submitted. Pre-proposals and white papers and letters of intents, if neither of those require a budget, and all this will be detailed in the call for proposals, if neither of those require a budget, then you are not necessarily required to get that approved before you submit it. The Research Weekly newsletter is a way of finding proposals, and Dr. Montalone mentioned that. We also have a really handy tool called Pivot. It is a funding opportunities database, and it's something that K-State pays a subscription for to be able to use. So you do have to be on campus to be able to use it, I believe. But you can I'll show you kind of what it looks like, but you can search by keyword and it pulls up a whole slew of funding opportunities. There's also grants.gov, which is the hub for all federal opportunities. You can search by keyword, by specific opportunity. There's also a lot of internal grant programs. And so K-State and individual colleges will have funding opportunities that are basically funded by K-State. You know, a lot of those are like pilot programs to help you get pilot data, seed data to help you find future funding for more bigger projects. You'll probably see those at any future institutions you end up. Those are announcements that would likely come from K-State or from your college dean. And then you can also just contact your grant specialist or contact pre-awards, say, I'm looking for funding for this. Can you help me or point me in the right direction? This is kind of a screenshot of Pivot. And so up at the top, you can basically punch in a keyword. And when you do that, it pulls up this. And it's a whole list of funding opportunities. It'll either have that year's opportunity or it'll have last year's with anticipation of, you know, if it's an annual call, having, it'll anticipate that there will be another call for the next year. But it gives you, you know, the amount that was offered, the deadline, and if you click on any one of those titles of those funding opportunities, it'll take you to the link of that opportunity. Really handy tool to use. This is a screenshot of grants.gov. It's not as user-friendly as Pivot. I mean, it's the feds, what can you expect? But you can punch in a keyword and it can pull up several opportunities. Sometimes it can be a little overwhelming because it pulls up opportunities from every single federal agency. But it's a good place to start. Or if you know of one specifically and you have the federal opportunity number, you can also plug that number in and it will pull the full announcement up. Okay, so you've found your funding, you found what call for proposal you want to apply for. So now you need to put your proposal together. A couple of acronyms to keep in mind, a PI or a PD, which stands for Principal Investigator or Project Director. Those are the contacts that are leading the project. So they, you know, they design it. They're the ones that if it's funded, they're going to be in charge of it. They're going to oversee it. Your co-I or co-investigator are ones that they're necessary to do the project, but they're kind of under the PI or the PD's direction to do the proposal. Like I said before, one thing you need to remember is that K-State review and approval is required before you submit. And that's not only to make sure that your proposal looks really good and that everything's in there, you know, make sure your proposal's at its best, but also because we need to make sure that any dollars or time or equipment or facilities that you're committing, you know, that K-State knows about it and everyone, as far as investigators, department heads, deans, are okay with it. The first thing that you need to work on when you find a funding opportunity and you decide to apply for it is your budget. That is the most important thing that we as an institution need to review and approve before it goes anywhere. So I always tell faculty, do the budget first. If you need to do an outline of your project to know what costs you need to put in the budget, that's fine. But it's really more efficient, instead of writing the entire narrative and then doing the budget, to do your budget first. And then while that's in the pipeline of getting approved at the university level, you can keep working on your narrative. A budget and a budget justification are usually what's required in a proposal. The budget is usually made up of two main types of costs, and that's directs and indirects. Anne is going to talk about the budget in a lot more detail later, so I'm not going to go over any more of that right now. The proposal package usually consists of several pieces of information, and this is just an example of several of those. A proposal summary or abstract is usually a paragraph or up to a page. The the call for proposals usually limits it to a certain character or page limit. Basically a summary, it says what it is, a summary of the project. Just tell me as an overview, what are you doing? The narrative is the full-blown, 20-page document that's explaining the project in detail. And then a lot of times you have your bibliography and references. Your facilities and other resources is a document that describes what facilities you have available to you at your institution to do the project. So it's basically a way to prove that, I have these resources already available for me to do this. So I'm prepped to do this. And then equipment is the same thing. That's a document where you describe, I have this equipment already available for me to do this project. Some investigator documents that are usually required from each investigator are a biosketch, which is like a CV. And the format for those really varies depending on the sponsor. And then a current pending list, which is a list of any current grant awards that you have or any pending proposals that you have. Specific aims is basically a document that lists the objectives, and then a research strategy is just another term for a narrative. You don't have to know just off the top of your head how necessarily what's required in those documents, because all call for proposals will give you guidelines for what needs to be in each of those. A couple of more documents that are usually asked for, vertebrate animals is a document that is a lot of times required by the USDA, and you have to answer 5 questions that detail how many animals do you have to use, are there any welfare issues, are there any pain issues. Select agent research, you have to talk about and justify any select agents you're going to use. Letters of support are usually letters that either come from your collaborators or co-investigators that are saying, this is a good project, you should fund it, in more politically correct terms, of course. And you can also get letters of support from stakeholders to whom the results of the project could benefit. And then there's a couple others on there. We don't have time to go over each of them, but like I said, any proposal, there will be guidelines that will tell you, here is the documents that need to be included, and here is what each document needs to talk about. Okay, so now that you've got your proposal put together, we have an internal routing system for, as I said, K-State has to review and approve all of the grant proposals that go out. And we have an electronic way of doing that. Right now, we use our own homegrown system called eProposals eSign. We are in the middle of transitioning to a new system called Cayuse SP. Most institutions these days do have an electronic way of routing their proposals through to get approval from everyone. Back when I started, we had to literally walk around campus and get hard signatures from everyone. It was very time consuming. So this is a very quick, easy way. I'm going to kind of give you a screenshots of what that looks like. Not only if you plan to submit a proposal from K-State, but any future institutions you may go to might have a similar system. There's a couple different ways to actually submit the proposal. Cayuse is a software that K-State actually pays a very expensive license for to use. It's a very user-friendly interface that interfaces between us and grants.gov. You can actually submit proposals directly from grants.gov, but it's the feds, so it's very clunky and not very user-friendly. And so Cayuse is a really nice software that helps us put those proposals together. FastLane is an online system that NSF, or the National Science Foundation, uses. And then there's several non-federal nonprofit sponsors that have their own website, their own online systems for submitting the actual proposal. So who approves the applications for submissions? Well, a couple of acronyms that you might hear. A lot of time RFPs will say that your grant proposal must be approved by your AOR before it's submitted. So an AOR is an authorized organizational representative. For K-State, that's Paul Lowe, who is our Associate Vice President for Research. And then an SPO and a GO is kind of those, it's referring to the same thing. So this is a screenshot of what eProposals eSign looks like. So your grant specialist will upload your abstract, your budget, and your budget justification. And then when we send it out to approve by everyone, everyone gets an email like this, and there's a link that they click on, and it takes them to a login. You log in with your K-State EID and password. And then this is what they're signing off on. So I don't know if you can see it, but there is a document there titled Transmittal Sheet. And that is an internal form that gives a rundown of what the proposal is. And I'll show you what that looks like. Now, in an actual proposal, you would see transmittal sheet, abstract, budget justification, so that as this is routing around through all investigators, department heads, everyone can look at those documents and make sure they're okay with it. The big paragraph at the bottom is what you really need to be concerned with. Make sure that, and this would include any future institution that you're at. When you are submitting a grant proposal, you are agreeing to abide not only by the sponsor policy and requirements, but also by university policy and requirements. That's what that paragraph basically says. So if you agree, you click accept, and then it signs your name. This is a screenshot of the internal routing form. This is an internal form only. This doesn't go to the sponsor. This is just for K-State. Other institutions have the same thing. Some of them call it a routing form. It just gives a rundown of the project, the title, who's involved, the dates, how much, and then some other information on the right side, more for internal purposes. The second page of the internal form is basically compliance. So these are all additional approvals that may be required. If your project involves vertebrate animals, of course, IACUC compliance, that has to be signed off on. Even if it's at the proposal stage and it's pending, we still have to check that, yes, there'll be live animals, so we will need an IACUC if it's funded, et cetera. And so this is what it looks like if you click accept. It basically types in the name on the signature line. So each investigator signs, each investigator's department head, each dean. This is Cayuse. This is the home screen for when you log into Cayuse. Some faculty do log in. A lot of times they just send us the docs and they want us to log in and do it. Other universities have other software that they also use. I think all of them are some kind of online software. So you log in and it gives you opportunities where you can find the opportunity, proposals, which is your proposal that you're working on. And this is kind of what the federal form looks like in Cayuse. Most faculty, their eyes cross when they see it. So that's why we have grant specialists. That's what we're here for. So our goal is to minimize the administrative burden on you all when you prepare a grant so that you can focus on the writing of the grant. So that's what grant specialists are there for, to help fill out these complicated federal forms. At the bottom, you'll see where we upload your documents. So that's where we would upload your narrative and your bibliography, et cetera. This is just a screenshot of Fastlane, which is the system that NSF uses. You would have a login as a faculty member someday. You'd have a login where you log in to start your proposal application. This is just an example of a non-federal sponsor, Morris Animal Foundation. They have their own system. You create an account, you log in, et cetera. Okay, so hopefully everybody knows what this movie is from, because otherwise you make me feel really old. Basically, the gist of this is please submit early. If you wait until the last minute, we can't offer you as much customer service as we would like to. The more time that you give your pre-awards office or your grant specialist office to help you with your proposal, the better your proposal will be. The last minute submissions that we have to throw together, things get missed. So it is much better if you start early. In fact, as soon as you find a funding opportunity that you want to apply for, tell your grant specialist, tell pre-awards, hey, I want to apply for this. They'll get it on their calendar and they can help you get started on it. So grants.gov, usually the federal opportunities set a deadline of your proposal is due by this date at 5 p.m. Eastern time. If you wait to submit it until 4:55 p.m. and the system is so bogged down because so many people are submitting and it doesn't go through, we're stuck. And so it's, as I said before, it's better to submit early. Your future institutions will thank you if you take that lesson with you. Oh, I'm going backwards. Okay, so you submitted your proposal and you have found out that you've got an award. So now what do you do? Well, a couple of acronyms, or more terminology really. There's a couple of different funding mechanisms. There's a grant, a contract, and there's actually a third one that should be there that I forgot to include, and it's called a cooperative agreement. There's a few differences between them. A grant is an award from a funding source which provides financial assistance to support a sponsored project, program, or activity. That would be more like your federal funding that you get. And then a contract is more of a procurement of services or goods. So if you had a connection with an industry company, with a for-profit company, and they asked you, you know, I'm trying to solve this problem, can you do this research to help me figure it out? And you agreed, that would be a contract. So that's a company coming to you, asking you to do research, and then you're providing them report of results, which is, that's the service you're providing is the research. And so they're under a contract, there's expected deliverables under a legally binding document. A cooperative agreement is something that usually comes from a federal agency such as the USDA, and it's called a cooperative agreement because it means that the sponsor has more say in how the project is going to go. So usually with a contract or a grant, you design the project on how it's going to be done, and then they agree to fund it. With a cooperative agreement, the sponsor has a little bit more say into the design of that project and even during the project on how it goes. You may get notice that you've been funded either directly to you, or if it's something federal, it usually goes to your institution's pre-awards office. Usually the PI is copied on the email, you know, congrats, we've agreed to fund your proposal, et cetera. And then once we get that email, we get the award proposal or process started. We do have to wait for a contract. So sometimes you'll get an email and then a contract will follow. So once we get that agreement, that contract, K-State reviews the terms and conditions that are in there. Sometimes we have to negotiate them, like if it's with a company, and then we sign it, and then we get started. One thing that we have to make sure is done before any grant account is set up, compliance has to be done. So if you have biohazards, you have to have IBC approval. If you have live animals, you've got to have your IACUC done. Typically, funds cannot be spent until that is done. And that's, you know, a liability issue to make sure that you've got all of your approvals in place. Once that's done, we get a grant account set up. And so there's actually an account number that if you have a time commitment to the grant, we literally charge a portion of the payroll to the grant account. When supplies need to be ordered, testing needs to be paid for, et cetera, it's paid for from that grant account. Okay, so you've got your award set up, and now you're getting started on your project. So you need to manage your award. So your responsibilities, assuming you're the PI, you need to execute the project as you've outlined in the proposal. Along those lines, you also need to abide by K-State policy, like compliance, and then also sponsor requirements, what's in the agreement. You do need to follow institutional purchasing policies and spend according to the project budget. Sometimes it doesn't always go exactly as planned, and we'll touch on that later. But you do have to make sure that you abide by our purchasing policies, which is something that either your departmental grant specialist or your accounting office will help you with. You do need to, we will help you with monitoring your grant account, but it is your responsibility to monitor your budget and your spending for the grant. And then of course, it's your responsibility to write the technical progress reports. Most sponsors require interim progress reports during the project and then a final progress report at the end. So our responsibility as a grant specialist, and this could also be your accounting office, what we do in the College of Veterinary Medicine is we send out monthly financial reports of each person's grant account. And it shows their budget and where their spending is compared to that budget. And then the financial reporting, a lot of times sponsors will require quarterly reports from us that detail how the grant is being spent. And so that's something that we prepare and we send out. We prepare them, and usually sponsored programs accounting sends them out. And then we can assist you with submitting your progress reports. A lot of times, like with federal sponsors, those have to be submitted through an online system. You have to write it, but if you give it to us, then we could submit it through the necessary system if needed. Like I mentioned before, sometimes, when you're putting together a proposal, you are estimating your budget and you are making a plan for how you want the project to go, but sometimes it doesn't always go as planned. Fortunately, there is some flexibility with that. The amount of flexibility really varies by the sponsor. And what we really have to do is any variances, we have to go back to the agreement or go back to the sponsor. One of the most common award modifications we have to do are time extensions. And that's basically saying, I don't need more money, I just need more time. Now, you cannot ask for a time extension just because you have money left that needs to be spent. There has to be a reason for the time extension. That is something that we go back to the sponsor and we ask them for a time extension. With federal proposals, depending on the agency, a lot of times we, at K-State, the government has granted us certain authorities to automatically granting one-time extensions. Sometimes you need to revise the budget. So, you estimate when you're doing your proposal how much things are going to cost. Sometimes payroll costs more than you think, or sometimes your equipment costs more. So you can revise your budget, but many times if it goes beyond the parameters of what the agreement entails, you do have to go back to the sponsor and ask for permission. So I have one sponsor that says, budget revisions are allowed without sponsor approval within $5,000. So, if we go over budget in a category over $5,000, we have to go back to them and ask to change the budget. That doesn't mean that you get to overspend what you have. We're just talking about overspending within budget categories. Scope of work, I've had times where PIs have to drop a name. They have to drop a name, or sometimes they even add one. And so again, that's something that any type of scope of work revision, you must go back to the sponsor and ask for permission. And then a change in personnel, I've had times where co-investigators leave, and so you need to drop an investigator or replace one. All of these modifications are something that your grant specialist can help you with. So as soon as you know that you need to change something, go talk to them, tell them the changes that need to be made, and they will know what needs to go back to the sponsor. Okay, so you've done your project, you've modified it as needed, and it's done. And so now you need to close out your award. So your responsibility as the PI is to prepare the final progress report. And this varies by sponsor. They usually indicate to you in the agreement, here's what the final progress report needs to entail. This is usually a more lengthy report than the interim progress reports that are submitted. Our responsibility through either your grant specialist and sponsor programs accounting, excuse me, is to prepare the final financial report. So that's a detailed report. The amount of detail varies by sponsor, but it basically shows how the award was spent. And then we zero out the grant account, or we close out if there's a balance left, and we get the accounting finished up. So that's kind of a quick rundown of the life cycle of a grant from cradle to grave. At the College of Veterinary Medicine, we're one of the few colleges that has departmental research administrators. So I help them cradle to grave. There are other institutions that have literally a pre-award office and a post-award office where they only do pre-award and they only do post-award. And we've been able to walk our faculty through the whole process. So that's a quick rundown. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Where would you be able to find what grant specialists you should be working with? Is that on the Bainbridge research? Or?
Yes, it's on the pre-awards website. And so it'll tell you, oh, yes, sorry. The question was, how do you find out which grant specialist you should go to ask for help? And that is on the K-State Research website, on the pre-awards website. It'll tell you based on the college who you need to work with. So, well, if there's no any further questions, Teresa is up next from the Writing Center to talk about writing strategies for your grant proposal. Thank you.
right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Teresa Merrick, and I'm coming to you from the Writing Center. I'm the Assistant Director for Outreach, and so you might see a lot of me at various sort of writing-sponsored activities here on campus. But I also teach writing and serve as a consultant for various technical writing industries. So just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from with some of the advice I have today. So what I'm going to try and focus on for the most part is how to work on your writing throughout the grant process, that sometimes we tend to compartmentalize our writing to one particular element or component of our timeline, when in fact what I'm going to recommend today is that you are writing throughout the process, taking notes, building your ideas, and even testing them out before you get started. So that's what our goal is going to be today. Okay. So one of the big things that you want to be considering as you're getting started in this grant writing process is how your research idea is going to be turned into a funding opportunity. And for some of you, it might be the first time you've had a chance to think about those implications. So the first step in getting funding for your research is to really think about its significance. And that's often obvious to you as the researcher, but it's time to start thinking about who else this matters to. And so you want to think about what your research is going to contribute to your own academic field of study and be able to write that down. You want to think about how it will contribute or impact your community, and that can be anywhere from municipal and local communities to something that's regional or national. You want to think about how your research is impacting your university. And so, you know, what you're doing to advance K-State in the news, but in the field of the research that you're working on. You also want to think about your own career goals as well, that's an important component of what you communicate in your grant writing, that this is going to be impactful to you. And so these are things you want to be considering in some detail. Okay. Then related to that, once you have an idea, you need to think about the measurable objectives that you have in terms of getting from start to finish in your work. And so you want to develop some of the contributions that I asked you to consider into these measurable objectives. So in order to be evaluated, in order to be understood, these objectives really have to be specific. They have to be tangible, they have to be measurable in some way, because you also have to communicate to your funders how you're going to accomplish those things within a certain timeline. And so your reviewers need to see that your objectives are specific enough that you can accomplish tasks within a certain amount of time. And so the first step in the writing process of these objectives is to start formulating your goals. Maybe you've already had a chance to think about that. Your second step is to turn that goal into your measurable objective, and I'll give you some examples. So this is one example of a general goal. So our after-school program will help children read better. So it's a nice goal. But we need to go beyond that as writers and think about how we make that more specific and measurable. So here is a better objective. Our after-school remedial educational program will assist 50 children in improving their research scores by 1 grade level, as demonstrated by standardized reading tests administered after participating in the program for 6 months. So you'll notice there's a lot of detail here. And there are metrics applied to sort of the scale of your work and your research, so number of children involved in the study. There are measurable things involved in terms of the outcomes as well, that you're not just going to conduct certain steps in your research, you're going to accomplish a certain number of things. So that is really key in terms of getting your idea to something that your reviewers will see as reasonable and measurable objectives that they can approve. Okay, so just to give you an example of what that can look like, I've pulled an example from one of my colleagues from his successful NEH grant. We get a lot of questions in the Writing Center from humanities applicants, just because sometimes these objectives feel a little bit harder to pin down. Not to say that those writing in science or education or social sciences are also, kind of dealing with this challenge, but humanities really varies quite widely. And so I thought I'd show you an example. So what Professor Lita Percone identified as his measurable objective was publication. As a writer, his research was something that he wanted to put forth. And he demonstrated that this not only was a publishable idea, but one that had already received interest. So he says, that a National Endowment for the Humanities summer stipend will enable me to complete and revise a draft of Black and More Than Black, Rearticulating Race in 21st Century African American Literature. So he has an identifiable goal here by the end of the funding period. And then he says NYU Press, Rutgers University Press, University of North Carolina Press, University of Georgia Press, and University of Minnesota Press have all expressed interest in the manuscript. Thus, I'm confident of acquiring a publishing venue for the completed project. So this is one example for those of you who are working in the humanities that you can think about how measurable objectives can work for you, that publishing venues is a demonstration that you have an avenue and a venue by the end of the funding opportunity. I'm going to show you some science and measurable objectives a little bit later on in today's discussion, so we'll get to that, don't worry. Okay, I always get people to write when I speak, so this is the next part for you. What we find when we talk to writers about grant writing throughout the process, but across campus, is that they identify the end stages of writing as the ones they fear the most, that they, fear the editing and making sure it's accurate and it's proofread and it's done right. But what we've noticed is that that fear is actually preventing us from getting started, and that the real challenge in the grant writing process comes at the beginning. So I'm going to get you started if you haven't already. What I would like you to do is think about how you can free write or use note-taking in a forced and small amount of time to get to the heart of what you want to put in your grant. So what I'm asking you to think about are a couple of things. So what value would your research add to the academic field? Or what is your critical imperative? So you're thinking about the implications of your work and your idea. How would your research positively impact the community outside of academia? What are the most significant impacts of your research? So we're not even just thinking about impacts, but significance of those. And then how are you going to measure them? So I'm going to force you to write for 5 minutes. And at the end of 5 minutes, I'm going to ask you to throw those notes away and turn to a partner and talk through those same things. And this is kind of a process we work through in the Writing Center as a way just to kind of get those ideas down. So you can get started, and I'll let you know when your 5 minutes is up. Okay, I'm going to give you one more minute. Okay, I'm going to stop you there. So what you've just done is a technique we encourage a lot of our writers to use at the Writing Center, kind of writing in a box style free writing, that sometimes it involves a set time and space to get months and months and months of work down to 5 minutes worth of writing. Because you're going to have an important process in your grant writing of taking months and months and months of work and turning that into your 20-page document, and then taking that 20-page document and turning it into a paragraph or a page, which will be your summary. And so it's important to think about what really matters and what language keeps repeating itself when you are forced to keep it short. So I'm going to ask you to keep it even shorter. Turn to a partner without looking at those notes you just wrote up. And I'd like you to see if you can move through those questions and talk to each other about the significance of your work. All right, go ahead. All right, I'll give you one more minute to wrap things up. Okay, I'm going to regroup back up here. Hopefully you found this exercise helpful. Hopefully it might have felt a little uncomfortable if you haven't had a chance to talk to somebody yet outside your field about your work, but these little activities are things I encourage you to do on a regular basis, because I'd like you to start paying attention to the things that seem to keep mattering, the phrases you keep using, the ideas that seem to be the ones that resonate with your audience, because you are working with a listener who could be very similar to somebody on your review panel. And something that we'll be talking about a little bit later on is who those reviewers are, because you're dealing with people who may be hearing about your field, your particular research work for the first time. And so pay attention to what's interesting, what matters to you, but also what seems to be mattering to that reader on the other side or the listener on the other side. Okay, so we're going to move through just a couple of other strategies just to help you with various stages of the proposal writing. So you've already done one of the activities that's recommended in a lot of the research on proposal drafting, which is getting a good pre-writing strategy in place, making sure that before you actually do the hardcore drafting of your work, you are documenting and planning out your ideas from the beginning. And so what you're going to see here is what we call the 9-step proposal conceptualization. This is coming from a series of researchers in the field, just to give you a sense of how you can break down and manage the tasks of pre-writing. Sometimes we find it hard to focus our ideas and give ourselves specific things to work on before we actually draft. So I won't go through them all in detail, but you can feel free to follow this as a means to kind of get yourself started. But you'll notice that it's helpful to give yourself particular things to write about and think about as you go. The next thing that you're going to want to do is collect some background information. This is part of your early planning process because it's important to be aware of who you're writing to and why. And so start collecting your background information about your organization early. Go through their websites, pore over their documents. A lot of organizations have sample grants and previous year's grants available for you to take a look at. So pay very close attention to what organizers are asking you for. The most important section of an organization's sort of website or information is their reviewer criteria. And I won't go through them in too much detail because Dr. Montalone will be giving you some great information about that. But this is where you should be pulling your own writing ideas from as well. You want to be basing what you're putting together off of what you see. And you use the criteria as a rubric throughout your writing process. Make sure you are aware of the format of your proposal early, again, so that you're not investing time in a format or a word count or a page length that's just not going to work. So give yourself those parameters early and make sure you're setting them there, keeping them there as a reminder throughout the process. Being aware in general of your organization's aims, their goals, their mission, sort of at large and not just for your particular grant series is important, because if you can show how your research is correlating with these aims or goals, your proposal is more likely to be approved. So look to what matters at that organization and make sure that you have the right grant organization to work with. Can you write to that? So just as an example, the screenshot from the NEH again, you look at the language that they're using to describe their goals. So NEH enables individuals and institutions across the United States to study, to preserve, to share the best of America's history and culture. So you kind of think about what that means. And if you can write to that, you are sort of proving through your process that you meet the goals and can kind of facilitate those goals through your work. So here's another shot from their website that talks in a bit more detail about what their mission looks like in practice. And so keep an eye out for lists, typically bullet point type lists, where they talk about what grants can do and what work in their funding organization looks like. So you'll see kind of at the bottom there, the NEH kind of talks about what they're looking for. This is something that's carried through NSF and USDA and DoD type grants. So just pay attention to whenever there's a list provided, there's usually a lot of good detail there. Okay. So your basic proposal structure is something you're going to see a lot of today, but it's important to be aware of kind of the writing advice applies even if the proposal structure across the board here in this room is going to be different for each one of you. There are common approaches, and so that's what I'm going to show you here, just so that you can see as a whole how they are working towards kind of a common goal. But your project summary, your executive summary, your abstract, this is the document that most people on your review panel will have read or will be reading right before they discuss things. This is sort of the document that gets the most sort of time on a reader's part. And then once you get into the nitty-gritty details of the grant, you have some people who will go through those elements, but there will be some people who will kind of skim it or will rely on more of the primary reviewers to provide that information to them. So your project summary, that information is really, really important from a writing perspective. And then the rest of the details should fit together, even if you have specific goals within each component that you need to communicate. As a whole, they should work together. Now, talking a little bit about the summary and executive summary abstract, it goes by many different names. So I'm just going to call it the summary from here on out. This is the snapshot of your research proposal. It's the mini version, pared down to one page, sometimes just one paragraph or a couple paragraphs. And this is the challenge in writing that often grant writers save for the last part. And I find that that typically helps. You kind of need to see where everything else is going before you get this information down. It's summarizing key information and key information only. And it should briefly explain kind of everything in a nutshell. So things that you kind of consider as you're reviewing your own summary and making sure it works. Is it talking about the problem that your research is responding to? Is it talking about how your research is actually going to solve it? Are you giving people those answers right up front in your summary? What parts of your research do you need funding for? Sometimes you're describing your plan and your mission as a whole, but the grant is specifically meant to be for particular components. And so you would communicate that here as well. Any other aspects that are deemed required by the organization. So those components need to be contained as a snapshot in your summary as well. And so that's really going to depend on what you see within your RFP. Okay. So the narrative is the next kind of writing component. It's the meat of your grant. It is the writing that you will agonize over and draft many times and find the most challenging. So thinking a little bit about sort of the general goals within the narrative, I find helpful. Ultimately, what reviewers are trying to figure out is why your project should be funded. Why should I give you money? But kind of related to that, why are you the person capable of carrying this out? So you're trying to communicate that not only are your ideas good, but you have the best means of solving them, of solving the problems, of conducting the research that you say needs to be conducted. So that is kind of the thing you're trying to prove throughout the process. And each component is demonstrating those capabilities. Then when you are able to provide some further detail about your work, again, you're referring throughout to your goals, those measurable objectives that I asked you to consider at the beginning. You're thinking about your research methods and procedures. So you have to demonstrate your credibility as well as your ability to accomplish the task. And so research methods are there to demonstrate those things. Any research questions or hypotheses that are guiding your work need to be present and need to be clear. Your evaluation methods, both for guiding your research, guiding your success, and guiding your outcomes, need to be presented as well. So you're writing not just about how you're going to do things, but how you're going to make sure that things are working when your research is complete. So that's looking towards sort of the later stages of your work, and you need to talk about that in your narrative too. You will often include discussion of other research in your work, in your narrative. So you might have a literature review, you might refer to other citations. These types of requirements or expectations vary across field, across grant and organization, but it's very common to use your demonstration of knowledge within the literature to demonstrate your capabilities as well as to show people that your field has yet to explore the opportunity that you are identifying. And so the same type of methods that you would conduct for literature review in your other documents can apply here as well. You have to be aware that your content, your formatting requirements are going to vary across the board. And so knowing kind of what you can do and what you can't is important. So knowing font size, knowing font types. Some grants are a little bit more broad about their requirements. Others are very, very specific. So when you're thinking about how you're going to organize your ideas, it's important to know if you're going to be constrained by any format related issues. So make sure you know that as well. The other thing that's nice to do in the narrative writing as well as the proofreading and revision process is to try to anticipate questions that readers might have. And the best way to do that is to ask readers of your work to give you some questions, because you have one shot in one piece of writing to convince people that you deserve lots of money. And so it's helpful to kind of think through the questions that might prevent them from having full information to award you. And so one of the best ways to kind of track yourself in your grant writing process is to think about the other side and think about what those questions might be. Okay. So again, I'm not going to go through the reviewer criteria in too much detail, but you'll see here that these types of elements should serve as your rubric, per se, of what you should be looking for in your own document. And so a lot of the criteria is built for readers who are coming from your field, but also from beyond it. And so the writing process is going to involve making sure that readers understand your terminology, understand your research questions, even if they are not coming from your field. So they need to be able to see how your ideas are working. Readers will love your proposal if it is logical, if it is organized, if it is well written, it is accurate. Things like that are important. And if they can see measurable outcomes, if they can really kind of point to things in the grant and that they can count up and identify as the objectives that you are going to be working with. It's important that you are using your language to appear that you're well qualified, while still balancing sort of the reader who might need some further explanation of your work than you are used to giving to people within your discipline. And so it's about kind of finding that right balance and making sure that you're actually adhering to the organization's specific goals and interests will be something the review panel will always keep in mind. You might have great ideas, but if you're not demonstrating in your writing how those ideas fit really well with the organization's goals, you have a problem. Okay, so looking to the other side, these are proposal weaknesses that we hear about from former reviewers or current reviewers, things that they talk about when it comes to the writing of proposals that they have to go through. The top problems are typically that you as a writer are not clearly identifying or substantiating a significant problem. And again, this seems like something that's so straightforward to us as we are the ones conducting the work. We know things are important, we know our work matters, but being able to articulate that to an outside reader can be a challenge. And so ask multiple people in your grant writing process if they can see a clear problem that feels significant, and if you've demonstrated its significance in particular places of your proposal. And then the other big thing just has to do with your funding and how you're talking about it. That, you know, you have a budget, but it's not clearly articulated how it's going to be used for your project activities. And that's where your grant writing specialists and offices will be fabulous for this, making sure that the way you're talking about how you will use funding will really matter to your reviewers. Some other problems that we pull out in our research when we look at what writing looks like here, if you don't really have a sufficient plan for evaluating the project, it seems like, you know, it's kind of fuzzy how you're measuring success and making sure that you're doing a good job, you can have a problem. If your time schedule is unreasonable, and then if your methods don't seem to suit the scope of your problem, if you have a great idea but still don't seem to have a good idea for how to solve it or how to approach it, again, your reviewer panel might recognize that. And then what we come down to in our Writing Center work is readability. And this is sort of the word that comes back to us many, many times when we talk to reviewers about what makes a good proposal. And they typically just say, it's readable. It's readable, it works. And so we're trying to figure out what that means. Readability is because you're dealing with academics from inside your field, outside your field, people who have never read anything from your field before. And so readability has to account for a huge range of knowledge and awareness. So if you are using phrasing, if you're considering your words and your terminology carefully, usually people will say, yeah, that was pretty readable. So some tips for that: make sure your project is easy to read and skim. You're using formatting, visual design, and sentence structure to help the ideas kind of jump out. You're working with a reader on your review panel who will likely skim. They've got a lot of things to read. And so skimmability is highly connected to readability. Use headings and subheadings to help you with that. Most people are kind of comfortable with that in various types of documents they've had to produce, but those types of headings and organizational strategies are encouraged in most proposal documents. Making sure that you provide definitions, even a key of technical and field-specific terms that will help your readers outside of your field to understand. Making sure that your topic sentences are strong, making sure they are pointed and specific. That is where your reviewers will look first when they are skimming to get the most information. And so whatever goes in the first sentence of each paragraph really has to count. I've sort of said this a few times, but I'll say it again because it's important. Read your work to someone outside your field. Ask them to give you feedback. Ask them specifically what they didn't know or what they found challenging or difficult to understand. Sometimes you're able to get away with some other like little formatting elements. I've seen proposals that use color. That can be helpful, although I would encourage it to be minimal. If it helps your document to stand out, that's great. But I do think about being a reviewer on certain things before, and I get handed the photocopied documents that don't have color on them. And so it's a formatting tool that may not reach all of your readers. So something to think about. Graphics and visuals, usually very helpful. That you might have guidance in your particular RFP as to how you would incorporate those things, but readers love looking at things rather than reading a long paragraph. So you can look to your research for elements that might be helpful to include. Okay, we're going to look at very quickly some useful writing and drafting strategies. Something that I'm going to keep repeating and I'll keep telling you is start writing now. Start writing earlier than you think you need to write. It will always take more time. But again, speaking to the research that we've looked at, writers of proposals struggle with this first step of getting started. And they typically find that once that barrier is taken care of, the other stuff goes a lot better than they think. It doesn't take quite as much time to edit and proofread as you think it's going to. Just get started now. You want to make sure that you're looking to some good resources to help you with that. I love Paul Sylvia. He has a fabulous book called How to Write a Lot. You might find this helpful not just for your grant writing, but for dissertation work and other types of stuff. What I love his work for is that he focuses on psychological barriers that occur when we are writing. What he identifies as specious barriers to writing, or things that might look a little familiar to you. I can't find time to write. I say that a lot. Also known as I would write more if I could just find big blocks of time. That's a lovely idea, but it's not going to happen. And so making specific times in your schedule, even if it's something like 10 or 15 minutes, can be really, really important. And so overcoming the barrier that you need a whole day or even a few hours to write is something that you might need to get over. Need to read more, need to get more research. I need to run more tests and get that other data set. That type of barrier often prevents us from writing. So he says to get over it. New equipment comes up a lot. We know how things work. But again, try not to think of it as something preventing you from just getting started. This is a big one. I write best when I'm inspired to write or when I feel like it. I don't usually feel like writing. I don't know about you, but that's something that, again, we need to try and work our way through. You just got to do it. You got to do it. There's a fabulous book called How to Write Your Dissertation in 15 Minutes a Day. Another really good resource. But again, same idea. You just need little blocks of time and you just need to get through them. And that's typically the best way to get started. Okay. So once you've scheduled that writing time with yourself, don't break it. Treat it like a commitment that you would adhere to like any other. Set reasonable daily goals for that. Make sure, find things that you are excited about. Work on those first. That can inspire you to do the other things that matter. Try not to take huge gaps of time or breaks between your writing work. That the best writers tend to be the ones that write daily, write regularly. And make sure that you're just not censoring yourself. It's amazing how much we can self-censor when we are doing just early stuff. Just get those ideas down, even if you have to throw it out and start over the next day. Don't worry about sentence level perfection. Don't worry about grammar and mechanics right now. You'll have lots of time to work through those things and lots of resources here on campus to help you with that. And share your writing with as many people you can throughout the process, as early as they will read it, and share it with them multiple times. I highly encourage you to find a really nice person that will read many, many drafts, because they can really see a process of change, and that matters. Visit us at the Writing Center. I know a lot of people have already heard of us, but just as a reminder, we offer up to an hour per week for graduate students and postdocs, where you can work side by side with an instructor or writing tutor and kind of go through your work. So we're here to listen if you can't find a friend that is ready to listen to you just yet. And there's our website there. Okay. Before I move to the last little set, are there any questions that you have about the writing process for your grant proposals? If there are no questions, we're going to do what I feel is the most helpful way to actually figure out what to do. I brought with me a sample grant, and I'm going to pass it out in a minute. And we've got some time to work in small groups and talk about what you're seeing. What we find is that the key to writing improvement is reading. And you should be making time to pull sample grants from your colleagues, from your organizations, and look at what is successful, because that will tell you what is working for those reviewers on the other side. And so what I'm going to put up here for you to look at while you read are some questions just to kind of help you figure out what you're looking for. I want you to pay attention to the writing and not the content. I want you to think about how the writing looks and how it's put together and how it's convincing. And I don't want you to read every word. I want you to act like a reviewer and skim. I want you to kind of see what you can get through in just a few minutes of reading and see what you notice in that time frame. So what moves, what strategies is that writer using to help a non-expert? And you are likely a non-expert for this particular grant through their research. How is that writer demonstrating sort of the exigence of their project? How are they kind of identifying the problem that they're going to solve? And where does that happen? That's what I'd like you to be paying attention to as well. How are they demonstrating their credibility and that they are the person to conduct this research? What design or formatting aspects do you notice? How are you noticing readability? Any general strengths that you observe? And I also like to point out that there are things sometimes that you don't like. There might be things in this document that you wouldn't do, and it's important to pay attention to that too, because there's going to be a variety of ways that writers will meet the goals and be successful. And this sample was a successful grant, so some context to keep in mind. Okay. I'm going to start passing these around, and my hope is that we'll have maybe 5 minutes just to wrap up with some useful discussion, but I'll come around and we can chat and you can kind of get through the things you see in that time frame. Okay. There should be enough copies for everyone, but if there isn't, like this is an activity I would like you to try and do with somebody else, so at least talk through the questions. So if you don't mind sharing, if we run out, that would be great. Okay, I really want to remind you of the reviewer's mindset here. You got a stack of these to get through. So I'm going to try and keep you to just another couple minutes to go through what you have. And then I want you to talk about it. Okay. All right, I'd like to make sure that we have some time left to talk through some specific things you're seeing, just so I don't eat into your break time. I have a few things that I made some notes on that I'll also try and save some time for as well, but let's start with you. You were given a pretty short amount of time to actually go through this, but I think that's helpful to really pay close attention to what stands out when you don't have a lot of time to read. Would anybody like to offer some of their kind of discussion or what they noticed when they read through this sample? Don't be shy. Yeah, thank you. Yes. So just to repeat, I'm going to repeat everybody a little bit, but sort of when you're trying to figure out as this new reader, like why does this matter? The heading, the little subheading on the second page does that for you. Why body size? I really like that. Being able to anticipate the moment when significance is really going to start to creep up on that reader, I think is really helpful, and it happens, pretty quickly in the narrative. Yeah. What else did you notice? Yes. Mm-hmm. I commented on that throughout my own note-taking on this, with one exception. I might as well tell you what I don't like. I don't like the very first sentence on the very first page. I have a pet peeve about "it is," at least when it comes at the beginning of something. That's just my personal opinion, but you might have some reviewers that have some pet peeves as well. But I was able to push that aside because I agree. The sentences start strong. Thinking a little bit more particularly about what that means, what you'll notice is that the writer is very careful about placing their verbs, their action items, early in the sentences. And so you'll see sort of various stages. I'm looking, just as an example, on the broader impacts section of the first page. This is their summary. This proposed project will formalize. I will disseminate. I will integrate. You're hearing your subject, which is the writer, and the verb. They're often placed like right next to each other. It's a strategy we often overlook, and it's something that can become problematic when we have a lot of things to get through in a sentence. If we're listing things off, if we have lots of terminology to describe, what happens is our verb gets pushed to the end of the sentence. The action is saved for the very end, and readers have a hard time resonating with that action if it doesn't come close to the subject. So that's something this writer really does well. And so the sentences start strong by keeping the action kind of front and center. So that's a strategy you can be looking for in your own writing. Something concrete to keep in mind is the verb as early in the sentence as I feel would be helpful. If it's pushed to the end, there might be an opportunity to bring it a little bit closer to the front. Yeah. Anything else that you noticed? Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. it is in this case, and that it was successful. But I understand what you're saying, and I think that speaks a little bit to what's happening in that last question I asked for you, that you're going to find a broad use of rhetorical strategies when you start looking, and not all of them are going to feel comfortable to you. I agree that interesting writing is usually varied more in that way, that your sentence structures kind of mix up long sentences and short ones, or you start things off a little differently. I would say that sometimes those things don't matter as much to a skimming reader who needs important information up front. I think that's a valuable point, though, that you're going to notice things that might be a little different from either other styles of writing that you're used to, or that are a little bit more direct or obvious than what you might be used to in other documents as well. And so just to kind of recap for the recording here, that when we see things that are repetitive, pay closer attention to the effect you're trying to achieve there. Are you breaking down a very complex issue or process? Sometimes a consistency of structure is really helpful, helps people to get through things quickly and easily. If you're not really describing anything that needs to be that parallel, can you talk about it? Can you switch it up with your sentence structure and add a little bit more variety? And that's more helpful when we're talking about broader impacts and implications, when we're setting more of a narrative tone for our work. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Any other questions? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. So the question is sort of, how much is everybody on your panel reading? Are they required to read a certain amount? I'm not going to give you too much detail on here, because Dr. Montalone is going to talk about this with some fabulous information. I will say, though, that it varies, that there will be people on your panel who will read the document in its entirety. There will be people who have read some of it or who have skimmed it. There will be people who will read the summary and not the longer narrative. There will be people who have maybe just know the basics and are walking into a meeting or a discussion among the panel, and they're skimming it really quickly, like just in advance of the discussion. So it's going to vary very widely. Your decisions are going to be made based on a group of people who've had various exposure to your work. So, yeah.
How much of report does the government produce to the responsible ones?
Sorry, could you repeat that question? I want to make sure I'm responding properly.
So maybe you read the proposal
Mm-hmm.
and make a judgment.
Oh, yes. Okay.
I think there has to come with some explanations.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This proposal should be supported because of that.
Mm-hmm.
How long, like one paragraph, there's an explanation, or 2 pages of explanation? Does that count?
Okay, so the question is how much content or how much writing in terms of response is expected for those on the review panel in order to justify what they're seeing. I'm not the expert on that. Is that something that will be kind of touched on in later discussion? Okay. Okay, I'll make sure you hear about that. There does have to be some justification, and so people are looking for specific examples they can point to. That a general feeling of this sounds great or I don't like this is not going to cut it, and they will look to particular things that are there or not there to justify their decision. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Here in the top written, I will do that. Is it possible for a single person to carry out the problem? Is it okay to write I will? It has to be people.
So the question about saying I will as opposed to we will, or using even third person language, that's going to, again, you'll see expectations vary. It's perfectly okay to identify yourself as the researcher if you are the primary one carrying out these particular activities. Oftentimes, though, this is a group activity, in which case, yes, the we If you need to differentiate between researchers, your organization will tell you that. But in general, first-person language is okay, and it helps you to be more direct about what you're talking about. That talking in passive voice or in the third person often takes up more space. So something to keep in mind. I'm going to just wrap up our conversation just with a few comments of my own, just to make sure that we're picking up on some of the themes, although you've already kind of pointed to some things that I thought were fabulous. I made the most notes on the first couple pages, and then I stopped kind of paying really, really close attention. And I think that's a typical pattern to be aware of. But I gleaned the most about the writing process from the overview, from the summary on the first page. But you'll notice how nicely it's set up. The headings work really well. And this is a strategy that's carried through the document. They start off general because they're speaking to the general categories that need to be addressed in that summary. But then you'll notice as we get into the narrative, those bolded headings get really nicely specific. They answer questions or they ask questions. They highlight details about their particular work that you can't just cut and paste into somebody else's proposal. And the headings provide that kind of high quality information that people can skim quickly. And so a good strategy as a writer is to pay close attention to those headings and think, if I'm just looking at those alone and not looking at what happens in between, am I following along from start to finish really well? And I think that's one thing this writer does quite well. I would say that the kind of the so what of this all, why I'm doing this and why I need to do funding is articulated early. It happens right in the first paragraph. This is what the challenge is. This is what I need. And then that narrative is carried throughout the rest of the discussion. And so it's something that gets articulated right in that first paragraph. Terminology and language is fairly accessible, especially in the intellectual merit portion of this first page. It's really nice as you're just getting this first dive into the subject matter that I as somebody who is a very non-technical audience member, can get a good idea of what's happening. So think about terminology that readers outside your field will need explanation on, define those terms, or think of better ones that are more general and applicable to people outside your field. And I think that's what this writer does fairly well. Going through the narrative, you see a beautiful balance of images and text. So think about when images matter. You don't need to have many to have good impact. Images also serve to break up your text so that we don't see just one big block of writing that we have to get through. Paragraphs are not particularly long. They don't span whole pages. They're broken up nicely. And the topic sentences or the first sentences of these paragraphs are really powerful. They're direct, they're specific. They build off of ideas from previous sentences and sections. And so you're making sure that you're moving through information and transitioning when you need to. And so transitions, topic sentences, and actions are often stated more directly than we're typically comfortable with. It's extremely helpful to a skimming reader who needs those connections to be quite obvious. All right, I could say a lot more, and I will just kind of end by saying, this is what you can keep doing. And the more you read, the more you'll recognize what works and how you can apply that into your own documents. The Writing Center, as well as all of your grant writing resources on campus, are happy to help you through this process, and it will happen. So just get writing and you'll be fine. Thank you for listening today.
We have a 20-minute break. And if you're done, don't get the time back in. Okay, so I don't know how to do the check-in.